The music had been playing for 3 hours straight, and not a single man in Caldwell, Kansas had asked Effie Hawthorne to dance. She stood at the edge of the Grange Hall with her hands folded neatly in front of her cream-colored dress, the one she had spent 4 evenings hemming and pressing, and she watched the lantern light catch the spinning skirts of women whose names the men already knew. The fiddles sang something bright and reckless, and boots struck the floorboards in rhythm, and every time a cowboy crossed the room to claim a partner, Effie felt her heart perform a small, private collapse that she refused to let show on her face. She was 24 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She had smiled at the right moments and looked away at the proper ones, and still the men of Caldwell looked through her the way sunlight looks through plain glass, passing over, never catching, never stopping. Martha Greer, who was pretty in the obvious and immediate way that men of limited imagination always preferred, glided past Effie's left shoulder and shot her a glance that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but existed in that devastating middle territory where both lived together comfortably. "You ought to sit down, Effie," Martha said, barely slowing her steps. "You look like you're waiting for a stage that isn't coming." The words landed with precision. They always did. Effie kept her chin level. She had years of practice holding her chin level, and it was in that exact moment, that precise instant of swallowed humiliation, that the fiddle stopped. Not slowed, not faded. Stopped, clean and sudden, as if the bow had been lifted from the strings by an invisible hand. The room held its breath. Couples slowed and separated, looking around in mild confusion, wiping their foreheads and reaching for their cups. The hall filled with the kind of quiet that only exists after loud music, a ringing, expectant silence that made every small sound enormous. Effie looked up. Across the crowded room, standing just inside the doors with his hat still in his hand, was Oliver Langston. She knew who he was the way everyone in Caldwell knew who he was, the way you know a landmark. The Langston Ranch sat 11 miles east of town, 5,000 acres of grass and sky that Oliver had expanded in 4 years from the modest inheritance his father had left to something that made other ranchers in the county speak his name with a particular careful respect. He was 31, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been argued with by wind and hard seasons, and had refused to yield. He was not the handsomest man in the room, but he was the kind of man whose presence rearranged the room around him without his seeming to notice or try. He was looking directly at Effie Hawthorne, not past her, not through her, at her. And then he began to walk toward her, and the silence stretched, and Effie felt something wild and terrified open in her chest like a door blown back by a storm she had not seen coming. This is where everything changed. But to understand what that moment meant, what it cost, and what it gave, and why it split Effie's life into before and after as cleanly as an axe splits wood, you have to go back to where it all truly began. Go back 6 months, to the first week of April in the year 1878, when Effie Hawthorne arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the afternoon stage from Wichita with one trunk, $11.40, and a letter of recommendation from the Methodist Ladies' Society of her hometown of Lawrence that described her as reliable, educated, and possessed of excellent moral character. The letter did not mention that she was also stubborn, quietly brilliant, and prone to forming opinions about people with an accuracy that most found unsettling. Lawrence had been kind to Effie in the way that small towns are kind to women they consider no threat, politely, at a distance. She was the schoolteacher's daughter, which meant she had more books in the house than most and more expectations loaded onto her like freight. Her father, James Hawthorne, had taught her to read Latin declensions before she was 7, and had told her, with the complete sincerity of a man who had never been young and female in the world, that education was its own protection and its own reward. James Hawthorne had died of pneumonia in January of 1878, leaving Effie the house, $43 in a tin on the mantelpiece, and the full weight of her own life. She sold the house in February. She paid the outstanding debts in March. She arrived in Caldwell in April with $11.40, and the Latin she did not particularly need. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town on the edge of becoming something either better or worse than it currently was, depending on who you asked and what they wanted from it. The cattle drives from Texas came through on the Kisham Trail, and the cowboys who rode them spent their wages and their pent-up months of hard living in about 48 hours of noise and commerce before the trail boss got them moving again. The permanent residents, the merchants, the farmers, the families who had put down roots and intended to stay, lived in a state of perpetual negotiation, with the chaos that the drives brought through town like seasonal weather. It was not a gentle place, but it had a school that needed a teacher, and Effie had teaching in her blood, and the position paid $30 a month with a small house included, which was more than adequate and less than comfortable, which is to say it was exactly what it was. She met the town through its children first, which she thought was probably the best way to meet any place. The children of Caldwell were, like children everywhere, honest in their assessments and brutal in their curiosity. On her first day, a boy named Thomas Whitfield, who was 8 and missing his 2 front teeth, told her that the last teacher had been run off by the Dobbs brothers, who were the sons of the grain merchant and had once put a live snake in the previous teacher's lunch pail. Effie looked at Thomas Whitfield for a long moment, and then told him that she had grown up in a house where snakes occasionally came in from the garden to escape the heat, and that she found them considerably less troubling than people who put them in other people's belongings. Thomas Whitfield stared at her with something approaching reverence, and word got around, and the Dobbs brothers never tested her. She was good at her job. She was, in fact, exceptional at it, in the way that people who have been shaped by loss and loneliness sometimes become exceptional at giving others what they most needed and never had, which in this case was the sense that thinking clearly and asking hard questions was not a shameful thing to do but a worthy one. The town appreciated her professionally and remained largely indifferent to her personally. This was the cruelty of Caldwell's particular brand of dismissal. It was not hostile. Nobody was unkind to Effie Hawthorne in any way that could be named and confronted. She was not insulted at the dry goods store or spoken to rudely on the street. She was simply not seen, not truly, in the way that mattered most. She was the schoolteacher, capable and dependable, a category rather than a person. The women of Caldwell maintained their social circles with the efficiency of people who had very little to differentiate their days, and therefore valued the differentiation that social standing provided. Mrs. Clara Whitfield, Thomas's mother, was the unofficial head of the Caldwell Ladies' Social Committee, and she ran the monthly socials at the Grange Hall with the organizational precision of a military campaign and the emotional warmth of a tax collection. She was not cruel to Effie, but she did not include her either, except in the technical sense. Everyone in town was invited, because exclusion would have been unseemly, but invitation and inclusion are different things, and Mrs. Whitfield understood that difference perfectly. Effie went to the first social in May because she told herself that she needed to establish herself in the community and that isolation would not serve her well. She went to the second in June because she was not a person who gave up easily. She went to the third in July because she had spent the previous Saturday night alone reading Middlemarch for the 3rd time, and she thought that even an uncomfortable social was preferable to spending another evening in the company of a novel whose heroine's capacity for self-sacrifice made Effie feel simultaneously admired and frustrated. At each of these socials, the same pattern repeated itself with the reliability of a natural phenomenon like rain following clouds or loneliness following pride. The fiddles would start. The men would ask their usual partners first, and then their second choices, and then their third choices, and somewhere in that descending order of preference, they would run out of willingness before they reached Effie, and she would stand at the edge of the room and watch and hold her chin level. It was not, she told herself during long nights in her small house on Maple Street, because she was ugly. She knew what she looked like well enough. She had her mother's dark auburn hair that coiled when it was damp and caught the light when she walked out of shadow. She had clever gray eyes that people sometimes found disconcerting because they gave the impression of assessing everything they looked at, which was accurate. She was slim and straight-backed and possessed of a kind of self-contained dignity that was, she understood in her more honest moments, precisely the problem. The men of Caldwell preferred women who required something of them, rescue or reassurance or the simple animal pleasure of being wanted and needed in obvious ways. Effie Hawthorne did not appear to require anything. She appeared entirely sufficient unto herself, and this was a quality that men who had not been raised to find intelligence attractive found deeply unnerving. She understood all of this. She had always understood it. Understanding it did not make it hurt any less when July's social ended, and she walked home alone under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost punishing in its beauty. It was in August that she first became aware of Oliver Langston as anything other than a name. He came into the schoolhouse on a Thursday morning in the second week of August, while the children were at their morning recess, and knocked on the door frame with the quiet courtesy of a man accustomed to announcing himself. He was wearing a work shirt and trail dust and carrying his hat in his left hand, and he looked around the room with the particular attention of someone who takes small details seriously. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I apologize for coming during your school day. I've got a situation I hoped you might help me with." Effie was erasing the morning's arithmetic problems from the chalkboard. She turned and assessed him in approximately 2 seconds and said, "Mr. Langston, what kind of situation?" He blinked slightly at her using his name before he'd given it. "You know who I am. Everyone in Caldwell knows who you are," Effie said, not unkindly. "That's what it means to have the largest ranch in the county. Please sit down if you'd like, though I should tell you the chairs are designed for 12-year-olds, so it may be less comfortable than you'd hope." He sat. The chair was ridiculous under him. He sat in it with complete seriousness regardless, and this raised Effie's opinion of him by several significant degrees. "I have 3 hands on my payroll who came up from Texas on the last drive and decided to stay on," he said. "Good workers. 2 of them can barely read, and the third can't at all. I was wondering if you offered any evening instruction. I'd pay their wages for the time and whatever fee you thought was fair on top of it." Effie set down her eraser. "You want me to teach grown men to read?" "Yes. In the evenings. 2 evenings a week was what I had in mind, if that's possible." She looked at him for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention she gave to anything that arrived unexpectedly. "Most employers in this county don't concern themselves with the literacy of their hired hands," she said. "Most employers have different priorities than I do," he said, without defensiveness or pride, just as a statement of fact. She found that she believed him. "Tuesday and Thursday evenings," she said. 6 o'clock. My rate for private instruction is 50 cents per student per session." "That's more than fair." He stood, unfolding himself from the child-sized chair with a grace that she found both amusing and oddly appealing. "I appreciate it, Miss Hawthorne. You haven't told me what the men's names are yet," he told her. They were called Rufus, who was from Waco and had a laugh like a large animal startling, and Charlie, who was from somewhere south of San Antonio and was quiet and serious about everything he attempted, and Willis, who was from a place he referred to only as the river country, and who turned out to be the one who could not read a single word but who had a memory so precise that he could repeat back anything said to him verbatim after hearing it once. They came on the appointed evenings, all 3, and they were awkward at first in the way that grown men are always awkward when they're being asked to do something they believe children do, to start at the beginning and admit the lack. But Effie had thought about this carefully. She did not approach them as she approached her 12-year-olds. She approached them as adults who had particular information gaps, and she found materials that were relevant to what they knew: letters connected to cattle, to land measurements, to the kinds of documents a hired hand might actually encounter and need to read. By the third session, something had loosened. Rufus started laughing at his own mistakes instead of going red with shame. Charlie started staying 20 minutes past the end of each session to work through additional problems on his own. Willis, who had that extraordinary memory, began to connect the letters he was learning to the sounds he heard, building the code from both directions simultaneously, and made faster progress than either of the other two. Oliver Langston came to collect them on the second Thursday, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse while Willis read aloud a short passage about a man who drove cattle from one place to another, stumbling only twice over longer words. And Oliver Langston's face did something that Effie found, unexpectedly, somewhat difficult to look away from. It was not a dramatic expression. It was quieter than that, something private and genuine, the face of a man who cared about the people who worked for him and was moved to see one of them achieving something he had doubted was possible. He caught Effie watching him. Neither of them looked away immediately. "He's working very hard," Effie said, meaning Willis. "He's the best worker I've got," Oliver said. "I never doubted he could do it. I just didn't know if he'd get the chance." She thought about that on the walk home. The deliberate distinction between doubting capability and limiting opportunity. It was a more sophisticated way of thinking about a person than she was accustomed to encountering in men who ran cattle operations and had calluses on their hands from work that left no room for abstraction. She told herself not to build significance from small observations. She told herself this again the following Tuesday, when he came again to collect his men and stayed in the doorway 5 minutes longer than was necessary, asking her about how she structured the learning, whether the materials she was using were effective, whether she'd considered expanding the evening sessions to anyone else in town who might benefit. "Are you asking because you're genuinely interested in the educational questions," she said, "or because you're making conversation?" He considered this with a seriousness she had not expected. "Both," he said finally. "I find I'm genuinely interested in the educational questions. I also find I'm making conversation. I don't see those as mutually exclusive." She looked at him. "No," she agreed. "I suppose they aren't." He left. She stood in the middle of the empty schoolroom for a moment with the oil lamp burning and the night crickets going outside and thought, with the particular wariness of someone who has been disappointed enough times to distrust pleasant surprises, that she should be very careful. The summer moved through its heat and into the drier, sharper air of September, and the cattle drives began to thin as the season turned. Caldwell settled back into itself, the permanent population exhaling after months of being crowded and overrun, and the social calendar of the ladies' committee expanded as if to fill the space left by the departing trail chaos. It was Mrs. Clara Whitfield who first told Effie, in that artful way she had of delivering information that was also a statement of value, that Marcus Dobbs, eldest of the grain merchant's sons, 27 years old, recently returned from a year in St. Louis, had expressed interest in the schoolteacher. "He asked about you specifically at the September social," Mrs. Whitfield told her over the counter at the dry goods store, with the satisfied expression of someone distributing a gift they weren't entirely sure the recipient deserved. "I thought you'd want to know." Effie thought about the snake in the lunch pail story. She thought about young Thomas Whitfield's gap-toothed assessment of the Dobbs brothers' character. She said, "That's kind of you to mention, Mrs. Whitfield," and bought her flour and went home. Marcus Dobbs was, on closer examination, a man who had learned a certain surface gloss in St. Louis without learning anything of substance beneath it. He was good-looking in a way that he was aware of, which dimmed the effect considerably. He came by the schoolhouse twice in September with various pretexts, once to discuss a younger brother's progress, once with a piece of equipment that he said belonged to the school district, and that Effie was fairly certain belonged to neither the school district nor to him, but to his father's supply house, donated for the purpose of providing an excuse. He was not unpleasant. He was attentive in the determined way of a man pursuing a target rather than a person. He asked her questions, and then answered them himself before she had quite finished forming her reply. He had opinions about education that were mostly wrong but were delivered with the confidence of someone who has never been told that being wrong is possible. Effie remained polite. She remained uninvested. She was more interested if she was being genuinely honest with herself, which she insisted on being, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts, in the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and in the man who came to collect his workers and stayed longer each time to speak with her. Oliver Langston was not pursuing her in any identifiable way. He was not bringing pretextual gifts or constructing excuses to be in her vicinity. What he was doing was something quieter, and she found, considerably more effective. He was treating her as though she was entirely worth talking to. He asked her questions, and then listened to the answers with the complete attention of someone for whom the answer actually mattered. He disagreed with her occasionally, on specific points, which she found bracing rather than offensive because his disagreements were grounded and reasoned rather than reflexive. He had read more than she had expected, and thought about what he had read, and connected the thinking to the living in ways that most men she knew kept deliberately separate. One Thursday in late September, after Rufus and Charlie and Willis had packed up their materials and headed out to the wagon, Oliver stayed longer than usual. It was cooler now in the evenings, and the lamp threw a circle of warm gold across the desks and the chalkboard, and outside the window the dark had the crisp edge of a season changing. Willis finished the first reader entirely last Tuesday, Effie told him, because she thought he should know. He told me, Oliver said. He was proud in a way he didn't quite have words for yet, which is an interesting thing, to watch a man feel an emotion he can't yet name. That's the thing about literacy, Effie said. It expands the vocabulary for experience, not just the vocabulary you use to describe it, but the one you use to actually think it through. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think about teaching the way I think about land, as something with a life of its own that responds to what you put into it." She looked at him. The lamp flickered, and outside something moved in the dark, an animal or the wind, and the night felt very still around the small lit room. "I hadn't thought of it quite that way," she said, "but yes, that's right." He put on his hat. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he turned, and there was something in his face, not quite hesitation, something more measured than that, something that suggested a thought carefully considered and then, for now, set aside. "Good night, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Good night, Mr. Langston," she said. She blew out the lamp and walked home in the October approaching dark and told herself, with considerably less success than previous attempts, that she should be very careful. October brought the harvest and the harvest social, which was the largest event the Ladies' Committee produced all year, and which transformed the Grange Hall into something genuinely festive. Paper lanterns and decorated tables and fiddlers brought in from 3 counties over who could play reels and waltzes and schottisches with equal competence. Effie prepared for it with a careful ambivalence that she recognized as self-protection. She spent what felt like an embarrassing amount of time on her dress, which was the cream-colored one she had been saving not for any special occasion she had been promised, but for one she had continued, stubbornly and against all recent evidence, to believe might eventually arrive. She put her dark auburn hair up in a style that took her 3 attempts to achieve, and that she thought, on the 3rd attempt, looked both elegant and natural. She wore the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's. She arrived at the Grange Hall at 7 in the evening, and the music had already started, the fiddles bright, and the people bright along with them, and the floor was full of skirts and boots, and the particular joy of people who worked very hard and had, for one evening, decided to be happy. Martha Greer was there in a dress the color of cornflowers, and she had 2 men competing for her first dance before she had removed her wrap. Several of the other women of Effie's general age had their partners already arranged or arrived quickly: the blacksmith's daughter, the banker's niece who was visiting from Abilene, even young Lucy Carmichael, who was barely 19, and had a laugh so infectious it seemed to work as a kind of spell. Effie stood at the edge of the room. An hour passed. She smiled at people she knew. She spoke pleasantly to Mrs. Whitfield about the decorations. She accepted a cup of cider from the refreshment table and held it as a kind of occupying gesture. Thomas Whitfield, her gap-toothed former informant who was now the proud possessor of 2 new front teeth and considerably more confidence, came over and told her that he had read the entirety of the book she had assigned over his weekend and that he thought the ending was unfair. "Good," she said. "Write me an argument for why the ending should have been different. Make the argument with evidence from the text." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of admiration and despair that she found genuinely endearing, and then ran off to rejoin his friends. She was standing there holding her cup of cider, watching Thomas run, thinking about the particular freedom of being 8 years old and having nowhere to stand that felt wrong, when Marcus Dobbs appeared beside her with the practiced casualness of someone who had been working up to the approach. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, with a smile that had been designed carefully. "You look lovely this evening." She thanked him. She waited. He turned toward the dance floor. "I don't suppose," he began. "Marcus." The voice came from behind them both. "Your father's looking for you. Something about the grain shipment." It was Reginald Webb, the freight manager, a solid, unimaginative man who had just, perhaps accidentally, just redirected Marcus Dobbs's intention. Marcus turned, looked annoyed, made his apologies to Effie with the distracted quality of a man whose real priorities had been briefly revealed, and went. He did not come back. The second hour became the third hour. The fiddles played and Effie stood, and the music was beautiful, and it felt, at moments, like a specific cruelty, to stand inside beauty while being invisibly excluded from it. She thought about her mother, who had been beautiful in the way that her father had apparently worshipped without much practical demonstration. She thought about her father, who had loved her sincerely and prepared her for nothing adequately. She thought about Lawrence and the house she had sold and the $43 in the tin. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried at public events. She held her chin level. And then Martha Greer walked past her and said, with the particular precision of a woman who has located a nerve and found it irresistible, "You ought to sit down, Effie. You look like you're waiting for a stage that isn't coming." And the music stopped, and Oliver Langston walked through the door. He crossed the room through the murmuring, resettling crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided exactly what he intends to do, and every step he took toward her was a step taken in front of everyone, publicly, visibly, in a room where the absence of music had made everyone's attention available and searching for something new to land on. Effie felt her pulse with unusual distinctness. She made no move, because she could not entirely trust what her body might do if she permitted it to move. He stopped in front of her. He had his hat in his hand, and his dark eyes were steady on her face, and there was nothing tentative or performed about his expression. It was completely direct, completely serious, and entirely unashamed. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "the music has stopped. I'd like to ask you to dance when it starts again if you're willing. But I also want to be honest with you because I think you prefer honesty to pretense. I've been working up to asking you for several months now, and I've run out of patience with myself for waiting." The room had gone very quiet in the way rooms do when something honest happens inside them, and everyone within earshot recognizes it. Effie looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment with those clever gray eyes that assessed everything, and she found exactly what she had suspected and hoped and feared she would find, that he meant every word of it, with the particular conviction of a man who does not speak carelessly. "You might have asked me several months ago," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite reproach and not quite relief, but lived between those two things, shimmering. "I know," he said. "I was being careful. I didn't want to be wrong." "Were you," she asked, "wrong "I don't think so," he said. "Are you going to tell me I am?" The fiddles started again. She took the hand he had not quite offered yet, reaching for it with the decisive gesture of someone who has been standing at the edge of things for long enough. "Ask me to dance," she said. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, with a smile that broke from his face like weather clearing, "would you please dance with me?" She danced with him. She danced with him through a reel and then a waltz, and the waltz was the kind of dance that requires proximity, and proximity turned out to be the thing that answered the question she had been too careful to ask directly. He moved with the particular ease of a man comfortable in his body and considerate of hers, and his hand at her back was warm and steady, and she found, to her very great surprise and also to her complete lack of surprise, that she fit into the space beside him with the ease of something that has always belonged there, but needed the right circumstances to be placed. The rest of the room continued, as it always does. Martha Greer danced with someone new, Mrs. Whitfield observed from the side with an expression that was recalibrating itself in real time, and Thomas Whitfield, passing through on some mission only he understood, caught Effie's eye across the hall and gave her an enormous, uncomplicated grin. After the dances, Oliver brought her cider from the refreshment table, the real kind, with an edge to it that the temperance women pretended not to notice, and they stood together at the side of the room, and for the first time in all the months she had been standing at the side of a room, the standing felt different. "You weren't planning to come tonight," she said. "It was not a question." "I planned to come and then talked myself out of it twice," he said. "My foreman told me I was being an idiot, though he put it more practically than that." "What did he say?" "He said a man who thinks about doing something for 6 months without doing it has already done the harder thing and ought to stop making it complicated." She considered this. "Your foreman is a wise man. He's 63 years old and has been right about most things his whole life. I've learned to listen when he speaks that plainly." They stayed until the social ended, past midnight, and when the lanterns began to be blown out and the fiddlers packed their instruments, and the crowd dispersed into the warm October night, Oliver walked her home. Maple Street was dark and the trees were losing their leaves, and the stars were exactly as unreasonably abundant as they had been the night of the July social. But they felt different now, generative rather than punishing, full of something possible rather than something withheld. At the door of her small house he stopped and she stopped, and they stood in the particular intimacy of a doorstep at night, which has been in every age a threshold between what is public and what is private, between what has been said and what might be. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I'd like to call on you. Properly and openly and with whatever you would require of me in terms of Oliver," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She felt the weight of it leaving her mouth like something surrendered deliberately. He was quiet. "Yes," she said, "you may call on me." He put his hat on. He walked back down the street. He did not look back, but his step had something in it, a quality, a lightness, that told her everything she needed to know about the face that was currently under that hat brim, pointing toward the dark. She went inside. She stood in her small kitchen with its small lamp and its ticking clock, and she allowed herself, privately and completely, to feel whatever it was she was feeling. It was not the dizzy infatuation she had read about in novels. It was something quieter and more structural, the feeling, as close as she could name it, of a weight she had been carrying without knowing being gently, deliberately, removed from her shoulders. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. But when she did, it was without the careful guardedness she had been maintaining for so long that she had stopped noticing it was there. He called on her the following Sunday. He brought no flowers, which she had expected and which she noted with approval, because flowers in late October in Kansas were either artificial or enormously effortful, and both of those options said something she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Instead, he came to the door at 2 in the afternoon and asked if she would like to walk with him, and she said yes, and they walked. They walked out along the edge of town, where the grass was brown and bending in the dry fall wind, and the sky was the particular shade of pale blue that exists only in the Great Plains after the summer has fully relented. He told her about the ranch, not with the air of a man cataloging his possessions, but with the specific pleasure of someone describing something they have built and tend and think about with ongoing engagement. He told her about the cattle operation and the winter preparations, and the new section of fence line that was going up before the first hard frost. She told him about the Tuesday and Thursday sessions, which were winding down as Willis and Charlie were now, she judged, sufficiently literate to proceed independently. She told him about Thomas Whitfield's impassioned essay arguing for an alternative ending to the book she had assigned, which had arrived on her desk on Friday, and which was, she told Oliver with genuine delight, one of the better pieces of critical thinking she had encountered from an 8-year-old who was still getting his new front teeth. Oliver laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh in an unguarded way, and it was a good laugh, full and genuine, with nothing performed about it. "You love that work," he said, meaning teaching. "I do," she said. "It's the only thing I've ever been completely certain was right for me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon, and then he said, "I think certainty about one's work is rarer than people admit. Most people pick what's available and make peace with it." "Is that what you did?" "No," he said. "The land chose me as much as I chose it. But I've met enough men who are miserable at what they do to know that being well matched to your work is not a given." They walked back as the light began its early fall slant, orange and long, and parted at the edge of town with a formality that was not cold but was careful. They were still, in the most basic sense, getting to know each other, and they were both people who took that process seriously. He called on her the following Sunday, and the one after that. November came in with its cold and its stripped trees and its particular brand of loneliness that empty fields can produce in a person if they're not careful. But Effie found that November, this particular November, was occupied with something new and sustaining, and the evenings in her small house were different now. She was reading different books, thinking about different things, composing small observations in her mind during the school day that she looked forward to sharing on Sunday afternoons. On the third Sunday in November, Oliver arrived at her door with something he had not brought before, a question. She could see it on him before he said it, the quality of purposefulness slightly heightened, the conversational ease of recent Sundays replaced with something more contained. They walked their usual route, and he waited until they had gotten to the far edge of town where the grass was longest and the wind had room, and then he said, "I want to tell you something about myself that I should have told you before now." She felt the small clutch of wariness. "All right," she said. "My father left me the ranch in good financial shape," he said. "But there was a period about 2 years before he died when I made decisions that were not good ones. I overextended on a land purchase up near the state line. I borrowed money I wasn't certain I could repay. I was 26, and I believed my own ambition without sufficient humility about what I didn't yet know." He paused. The wind moved through the grass. "I nearly lost everything," he said. "The land I have now, the ranch that operates the way it does, it exists because I spent the following 3 years working at a level that didn't leave much room for anything else. I didn't want you to believe the current picture is the whole picture. The current picture was built on a significant mistake, and I think a person who matters to you deserves to know that." Effie walked beside him for a moment before she spoke. "What did you learn from it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Is that really your first question?" "It's my most important question," she said. "The mistake itself matters less than what it taught you. If you learned the right things, then the mistake was worth whatever it cost." He was quiet for a moment. "I learned that certainty without knowledge isn't confidence, it's arrogance," he said. "I learned to distinguish between the two, and I learned that the people who tell you hard truths when you'd rather hear comfortable ones are more valuable than people who tell you what you want." She nodded slowly. "That is the right thing to have learned," she said. He stopped walking. He turned to face her, and the pale November light was behind him, and he said, "Effie." It was the first time he had used her given name. She understood the weight of the exchange. She had used his, weeks ago, at a threshold in the dark, and now he was returning it, and what was being handed back was not just a name but a particular kind of acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something that is too soon," he said. "I'm going to ask it anyway because I've established that waiting too long is not a habit I want to preserve. And because I believe with the kind of certainty that is based on evidence rather than wishful thinking, that you are exactly who I want to know for the rest of my life." The wind moved the dry grass. A hawk crossed the sky very high up, riding a thermal. "Oliver," she said, and her voice was steadier than her heartbeat by a significant margin, "if you are about to ask me what I think you're about to ask me, I want you to know that you are welcome to ask it, and I will give you an honest answer." "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not immediately if you need time. Not without whatever courtship you think is appropriate and right. But will you tell me that it's where we're headed if the next months bear out what these past months have made me believe?" She looked at him. She looked at him with those gray eyes that assessed everything, and she thought about her father's house and the tin on the mantelpiece, and the letter from the Methodist Ladies' Society, and the $11.40, and the long, empty edges of the socials where she had stood for months holding herself together with the determination of someone who had decided that dignity was non-negotiable regardless of the cost. She thought about the schoolroom with its circle of lamplight and a man in a child-sized chair taking her seriously. She thought about a dance floor and a music stopped and a man walking toward her without hesitation. "Yes," she said, "that is where we're headed." He reached out and took her hand, not the urgent grip of someone making a claim, but the deliberate, careful hold of someone accepting something precious that has been offered to them. His hand was warm and work-roughened and exactly right. They walked back to town in the November cold with their hands together, and the world looked to Effie like it had been slightly rearranged in her favor, and she allowed herself to believe in it, which was the hardest thing she had done in recent memory and also the most necessary. He spoke to her formally 2 weeks later, which is to say he appeared at her door on a Tuesday evening with a piece of paper that turned out to be a specification of his financial situation, land deeds, the account at the Caldwell bank, the note on the eastern pasture which would be fully paid by March, and he laid it on her kitchen table and sat across from her and said, "I want you to make this decision with full information. I won't have you take my word for anything that can be documented." She looked at the papers. She had not expected this, and the precision of her not expecting it told her something about the persistent disparity between what she had been offered by the world and what she actually deserved. She looked at the papers and then she looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." She read through the documents with the attention she gave to anything important. The ranch was exactly what he had described: well-managed, productive, honest in its accounting. The debt was real and the repayment schedule was realistic and bore out exactly what he'd said. "Everything is as you represented it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I didn't doubt it." "I know you didn't," he said. "I still wanted you to be able to verify it. There's a difference between trust that is chosen and trust that has no other option. I want you to have the choosing kind." She folded the papers neatly and slid them back across the table to him. And then she did something she had not planned, not precisely. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, just briefly, just the pressure of it, and she said, "Oliver, I'm going to marry you. You can stop auditing your own character." He turned his hand under hers and held it, and he laughed, that good, real laugh, and she laughed with him. And in the small kitchen of the small house on Maple Street, with the clock ticking and the cold outside and the lamp burning between them, something settled into place that had the feeling of permanence. They told no one immediately. This was a choice she made and he respected. She wanted the engagement to be hers first, for a small and private time, before it became a piece of social information to be processed and opined upon by a town that had spent months watching her stand at the edge of rooms and had formed its conclusions accordingly. She told the children first, in the way that their complete predictability on this subject was a comfort. They were fascinated and completely unsubtle about it. Thomas Whitfield, who was by now fiercely loyal to her in the way of children who have been treated as intelligent, told her with great seriousness that he had always thought Mr. Langston was the best rancher in the county, and that this was an excellent decision. She told Martha Greer on a Wednesday morning in December at the dry goods store, choosing the encounter deliberately because Martha's particular brand of social cruelty fed on information asymmetry, and Effie preferred to remove that advantage directly. She told her simply and without fanfare. She was engaged to Oliver Langston. They planned to marry in the spring. Martha's face performed a complicated series of small adjustments before settling into a smile that was not warm but was functional. "How wonderful," Martha said, and her voice had the specific quality of a woman who is determining whether to be gracious or cutting, and has chosen gracious because it offers better long-term positioning. "It is wonderful," Effie agreed pleasantly and bought her sugar and left. Mrs. Clara Whitfield received the news with a recalibration that was, if anything, more interesting to observe than Martha's, because Mrs. Whitfield was genuinely intelligent in a social way and understood immediately what this engagement meant in terms of the town's hierarchy and also what it said about her own oversight. Oliver Langston was the most significant rancher in the county. The schoolteacher she had been quietly ignoring for 6 months was going to be his wife. These two facts, processed together, had implications. "I always thought you were well suited to serious company," Mrs. Whitfield told her, which was about as graceful as she was capable of being given the circumstances. Effie thanked her with complete sincerity, because she understood the effort it cost and thought it should be acknowledged. December moved through its cold into Christmas, and Christmas in Caldwell in 1878 was a modest but real affair, church services and community dinners, and the particular warmth of people who have been pressed together by winter deciding to make something good of the proximity. Oliver and Effie went together to the Christmas church service, which was the first time they appeared in town together in the kind of deliberate, public way that made the nature of the relationship unmistakable to anyone who had missed the announcement. Sitting beside him in the pew with the candlelight and the singing around them, Effie felt, with a clarity that surprised her for its completeness, that she was in the right place. Not just the right church on the right evening, but the right life. That the specific accumulation of losses and loneliness and held-chin stubbornness had been leading, without her knowledge or consent, to this. She did not say this to him. She held it for herself, for a while, the way you hold something beautiful before you know what to do with it. They set the date for the last Saturday in April, which gave them the better part of 4 months' time, enough to plan without too much time to overthink. Oliver arranged with the county court in Caldwell for the marriage license. Effie wrote to the school board about her intentions, which produced a brief bureaucratic anxiety about replacement that she helped resolve by recommending a young woman from Lawrence whom she knew and trusted. January was cold and the world was contracted into fire-lit rooms and short days, and Effie and Oliver spent the winter Sundays in her kitchen most often now, or occasionally at the ranch house when she rode out with him in the wagon. And the ranch house was a revelation, not grand, but spacious and well-made, built by Oliver's father with the practical intelligence of someone who planned to stay. The rooms needed a woman's attention, he said, not with apology but with honest acknowledgement, and Effie walked through them with the particular pleasure of someone seeing a space they are about to inhabit and feeling, rather than just thinking, that it will be good. The parlor had a window that faced east, and the morning light came through it in January like a promise. The kitchen was larger than any room she had lived in, with a cast-iron range that had years of seasoning in it, and a view of the creek pasture where the horses went in the mornings. There was a room off the back hallway that was empty, used for storage. And when she looked at it, Oliver looked at her looking at it and said nothing. But the understanding was there between them without words. February brought a blizzard that shut down the roads for 4 days and kept everyone inside their own situations. And Effie sat in her small house on Maple Street with the stove going and the wind loud against the walls, and read, and thought, and wrote letters. One to a cousin in Ohio she had not contacted in 2 years, one to the Methodist Ladies' Society of Lawrence informing them of her engagement, one to Oliver that she did not intend as a love letter, but that became one by the 3rd page, which she considered sending, and then filed in the box under her bed, telling herself she would give it to him in person when she had edited it. She gave it to him in person without editing it, on the first Sunday after the blizzard when the roads cleared enough for travel, and she handed it to him across the kitchen table with the contained expression of someone prepared for any outcome. He read it at the table while she made coffee, and she kept her back to him for most of it, and when she finally turned around he was looking at the last page with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and moved and very still, the face of a man receiving something he had not been sure he would ever have. "Effie," he said. "Don't make it formal," she said quickly. "I know it was a blizzard. I had a great deal of time to think." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to her, and he held her face in his work-roughened hands very carefully, and he said, "I love you. I have wanted to say that for some time, and I have been holding it because I didn't want to speak before you were ready to hear it." She breathed. She looked at him at very close range, which was a different experience from looking at him across a room, across a table this close. The dark eyes were warmer than they looked from a distance, and the jaw that had refused to yield to wind and seasons was softer at this proximity, and she was entirely undone and entirely steady at the same time, which she had not known was possible. "I love you," she said. "That's what the letter was about. I just couldn't." She stopped, smiled. "I couldn't say it as directly as that out loud, yet." "Yet," he repeated. "I'm practicing," she said. He kissed her then, for the first time, with the gentleness of someone who has waited long enough that the waiting is part of the moment, and she kissed him back with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to do nothing by half measures anymore. The spring came in the way that springs come in Kansas, not gradually but in the sudden, decisive way of a resolved argument, one day still February and the next with grass already pushing green through the brown, the creek running cold and fast with melt, the sky a blue so strong it seemed structural. April arrived with its particular excitement and its particular weight. The wedding was planned for the last Saturday of the month, which fell on the 26th, and in the weeks leading up to it, Effie moved through her days with a compound feeling that she catalogued carefully, because she was a person who believed in knowing what she felt rather than just feeling it. Anticipation, which was clean and real. A thread of grief for her father, who would have loved Oliver with the respect of one serious man for another. A residual, fading disbelief, the ghost of the woman who had stood at edges waiting, and underneath all of it, steady and warm and increasingly the dominant note, something that she could only describe as rightness. The deep rightness of a life turning toward what it was meant to be. The evening sessions had long since concluded. Willis, Charlie, and Rufus had each continued reading on their own through the winter, and Willis had sent word through Oliver in March that he had finished a full book, the complete account of a man who had gone west from Ohio in the early trail days, and that he had found it, in his precise phrase, more interesting than expected and less frightening than his own experience was. Effie had sent back word that she was extremely proud of him, and that he should write to her about what the book had made him think. And he did, a letter of 3 pages in handwriting that was still effortful but was entirely legible, containing observations about the nature of courage, and the way that time changes a man's reckoning of danger, that were some of the most honest things she had read in years. She kept that letter in the same box as the one she had written to Oliver in the blizzard. The wedding was small by the standards of what the town's social ambitions would have preferred, and exactly the right size by every other standard. They were married at the Caldwell Methodist Church on the 26th of April, 1879, on a morning that was warm with the first real warmth of the year, and smelled of new grass and creek water, and the lilac bush at the side of the church that was about 10 days from bloom. Oliver stood at the front of the church with his good coat on and his hat in his hand, and looked at her when she came through the door with the complete attention she had first noticed in a child-sized chair in a schoolroom 8 months ago, and whatever was in her face in response must have been worth the looking, because his expression transformed into something that was not quite the smile she was accustomed to seeing, but was deeper and quieter, and had the quality of a rival. Reverend Harmon, who was a dry and practical man but decent at the important parts of his work, read the service with appropriate gravity and more than appropriate brevity. Oliver spoke his promises in the voice he used for things that mattered, low and direct and entirely firm, and Effie spoke hers with the clarity of a woman who has thought about every word and means every one. When Reverend Harmon said the words that closed the ceremony, Oliver placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, not extravagant, permanent, and she felt the weight of it as something real and grounding. And when he kissed her in front of the assembled witnesses, she heard, distantly, the murmur and rustle of the room's approval, which she found she cared about considerably less than the warmth of his hands, and the absolute conviction that this was the right thing, the true thing. The thing that had been worth all the waiting and all the held-chin evenings, and all the years of being misread by a world that was too limited to see her clearly. Thomas Whitfield, who was 9 now and had been allowed to attend as a concession to Effie's fondness for him, threw rice with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for this specific responsibility his whole life. The reception was held at the Grange Hall, which had been decorated by a women's committee that included, with whatever mix of genuine goodwill and social repositioning, most of the women who had spent the previous year looking past Effie or through her. The hall was beautiful with ribbons and late spring flowers from whatever gardens and fields had produced them, and the fiddlers played, and this time Effie danced at the center of the room, not the edge, and she danced with her husband, and it was the waltz again, and his hand was at her back, and the distance between this night and the October evening when the music stopped and he had walked toward her was 8 months and an entire life. They drove out to the ranch that evening, the late spring sunset enormous in the sky ahead of them and the road dry and smooth under the wagon wheels, and Effie sat beside Oliver with their shoulders touching and watched the light change from gold to pink to the first color-draining gray of dusk. And the ranch house came into sight with its lit windows. His foreman, whose name was Gideon Cross and who had been right about most things his whole life, had lit the lamps against their coming, and it looked, in the early dark, exactly like what it was, a home. Gideon Cross was 63 years old and built like a cedar post, and had the eyes of a man who had seen everything at least twice, and had stopped being surprised by most of it. He met them in the yard with a nod that was his equivalent of a standing ovation, and told Oliver there was supper on the stove, and told Effie, in a separate communication delivered with slightly more ceremony, that he was glad she was there, and that the east parlor window had always wanted someone to put a chair in front of it, and that he hoped she'd be comfortable. Effie looked at Gideon Cross and felt an immediate and complete respect for him. "Thank you, Mr. Cross," she said. "I suspect we're going to get along very well." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with what might, on a man with less firmly established reserve, have been the beginning of a smile. "I suspect so, too." They ate the supper Gideon had left, and the house settled around them in its evening sounds, the creak of wood, the distant movement of the horses in the pasture, the creek below the back field talking to itself in the dark, and it was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, the first ordinary evening of a new life. Summer came to the ranch with a different quality than summer in town. It was larger, more physical, more connected to weather and soil, and the cycle of work that the land demanded. Effie planted a kitchen garden along the south fence, which was modest by her intentions and would grow more ambitious with future seasons. She continued to think about teaching and talked to Oliver about it, and he listened in the way he always listened, which was the way of a man who will not make a decision for someone else about what they need, but will think it through alongside them. She wrote to the school board and offered to continue the instruction through the following fall, splitting her time between the ranch and the town 4 days a week, which the board accepted with the efficiency of people who had been worried about the school year and were relieved not to have to worry anymore. She rode into Caldwell on the school mornings, 3 miles by the direct road that became familiar under the hooves of the bay mare Oliver gave her, a steady, intelligent animal with a practical temperament and a very slight tendency to take personal offense at prairie dogs, which made the morning rides lively. The children were, if anything, even more engaged with her now, which she suspected was partly the universal interest of young people in teachers who have undergone notable life events, and partly genuine. Thomas Whitfield had, by September, progressed to reading at a level 2 years ahead of his class, and had started writing stories on his own, which he showed to Effie with the particular mixture of bravado and terror that all young writers display on first presenting their work. She read them carefully and told him the truth about them, what worked, what didn't, what questions they raised, what they were reaching for. He took the critiques with the gravity of someone who has decided to be serious about something and is big enough to understand that seriousness requires honesty. In October, exactly 1 year after the evening the music stopped and the world changed, Effie told Oliver what she had known for 3 weeks and had been carrying privately, that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the evening after supper, sitting in the parlor with the lamp lit and the east-facing window dark, and his reaction was the kind that she had, in her most cautious pre-Oliver self, assumed she was probably not the sort of person life was going to produce for her. He set down the account book he had been going through and he looked at her, and the look on his face was the same one she had seen when Willis read aloud from the first reader in the lamplight of the schoolroom, that private, genuine, unmistakably moved expression that was not for performance or consumption, but was simply the truth of how he felt. He came across the room and held her, not dramatically but completely, with the full presence of a man who is actually there, and she let herself be held, which was not something that had come naturally but had gotten easier every month, and she thought that maybe the best definition of the right person was the one who makes the things you were never quite able to do feel possible. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I've been fairly sick in the mornings, but by noon I'm entirely myself. I'll tell Gideon to delay the morning work until you're ready." "You will not," she said. "The ranch doesn't stop because I'm nauseated. I'm perfectly capable of Effie." "What?" "Let me do 1 or 2 things," he said, and his voice had the particular combination of warmth and gentle stubbornness that she had come to recognize as his version of a hard line. "You can be entirely capable and also let me do 1 or 2 things. These are not mutually exclusive." She paused. She heard her own language return to her. "All right," she said. "1 or 2 things." "Thank you," he said with a completely straight face. She laughed. He held her while she laughed. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a good one in the specific way that winters can be good when you are inside a life that has weight and warmth to it. The ranch work continued in its cold weather mode, the cattle on their winter pasture, the fence repairs and equipment maintenance that occupied the hands during the short days, the account books that Oliver worked through in the evenings with the meticulous care of a man who had once been insufficiently meticulous and had not forgotten what that cost. Effie taught through November and into the first week of December, when the cold and the increasing impracticality of the morning ride persuaded her to suspend the term earlier than usual. She had arranged with the school board for a temporary instructor through January, and she spent December in the ranch house reading and sewing, and having long conversations with Gideon Cross, who turned out to be one of the most quietly learned men she had ever encountered. He had grown up in Georgia before the war, had been educated by a planter's wife who had taken a personal interest in the education of the enslaved people on her husband's estate. An act of profound complexity, whose ethics Gideon discussed with the sophisticated awareness of a man who had spent decades sorting out the difference between receiving something valuable and the circumstances under which it was given. Effie and Gideon Cross talked about things that she had not had conversations about in Caldwell: the nature of freedom, the specific injustice of the circumstances that had shaped his life before the war and after, the particular dignity he had claimed for himself in the decades since, moving west as so many freed men had done, making a new life on ground that did not know his past and did not require him to perform the history others had put on him. Oliver listened to these conversations sometimes, from the edge of the room, with the quiet attention of a man learning something he recognized he needed to understand better, and occasionally contributed, and was not afraid to say when he didn't know enough about something to have a useful opinion. Effie thought that this, too, was part of what made him the right person, not that he was perfect, but that he was genuinely working towards something, that the growth was real and the intention behind it was honest. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1880, in the upstairs room of the ranch house with the midwife from Caldwell, Mrs. Agnes Barrett, who was brisk and efficient and had approximately zero tolerance for drama, which was exactly the right quality in a midwife. It was a long labor, 12 hours from first certainty to final outcome, and Oliver paced the downstairs with a controlled, white-knuckled worry that Gideon managed by putting him to work on various tasks of escalating irrelevance, until Agnes came down the stairs at 4 in the morning with the manner of someone who has just successfully managed a significant enterprise. "Mother and son are both well," she said. "You can go up." Oliver took the stairs 2 at a time. Effie was tired in the specific, profound, accomplished way of someone who has done something that required everything they had. She was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, wrapped in the flannel blanket they had prepared, and the lamp was turned low, and the window was showing the first gray of a winter dawn. The baby had his father's dark hair already, improbably, a visible amount of it, and his mother's habit of regarding whatever he was looking at with an expression of serious assessment. Oliver sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son for a moment without speaking, and Effie watched him look. "He's very serious," Oliver said finally. "He is," she agreed. "I suspect he's forming opinions already. That's not possible for a newborn." "It was possible for me," she said. "I was forming opinions from the beginning." He reached out and very carefully touched the baby's cheek with one finger, the gentleness of the gesture entirely at odds with the hands that built fence and managed cattle and wrote in account books, and the baby turned his head toward the touch with the ancient instinct of the new, and Oliver's face did the thing it did when something true and moving happened in front of him. "James," Effie said, "if you agree, for my father." "James," Oliver said. "Yes." James Oliver Langston was, from his first days, a person with definite preferences and the means to communicate them clearly, which everybody found exhausting and endearing in precisely equal measure. He had his father's steadiness under his mother's curiosity, and he watched the world with the attentiveness of someone who is filing everything away for future reference. The spring of 1880 was the best spring Effie had experienced, which she was aware was an embarrassingly high claim, but which she maintained was accurate. James learned to hold his head up with the proud determination of someone refusing to yield to gravity. The kitchen garden was expanded along the full south fence and planted with a range of vegetables that Gideon Cross, who turned out to have strong and grounded opinions about kitchen gardens, helped her plan with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting years for someone to take the subject seriously. The east parlor window, which Gideon had said wanted a chair, had acquired both a chair and a small table and became Effie's reading corner, where she sat in the morning light that came through it so promisingly and read, and thought, and nursed James in the early months, and watched the creek pasture where the horses moved in the blue and gold distance. She went back to teaching in the fall. The school board, who had been managing with a rotation of temporary instructors for the spring, and found none of them satisfactory by the exacting standard of a town that had been spoiled by quality, received her return with what she could only describe as relief. Thomas Whitfield, now 10 and reading at what she assessed as an adult level, had progressed to the point where she thought he needed materials beyond what the school district provided, and she began supplementing his curriculum from her own library, which had grown considerably since her Lawrence days and occupied 3 shelves in the ranch house parlor that Oliver had built specifically for the purpose. Thomas's parents had, by this point, a dawning awareness that their son was unusual, which they were processing with the mixture of pride and bewilderment of people encountering something they hadn't planned for. Effie spoke with them plainly. Their son had exceptional intellectual gifts, and what he needed more than anything was to be taken seriously and given challenges appropriate to his actual level rather than his age. Clara Whitfield, who had her own quiet intelligence that the strictures of her social role largely prevented her from exercising, listened to this with the focused attention of a woman receiving information that has personal resonance. And at the end of the conversation she said, in a voice that was different from her usual social tone, something more direct, something that sounded more like who she actually was, "Thank you for seeing him clearly, Mrs. Langston." "He makes himself easy to see clearly," Effie said. "He's very like his mother in that way." Clara Whitfield looked at her for a moment and then did something Effie had never seen her do, which was to simply drop all the social machinery and be, briefly, entirely unguarded. "I want him to have a different life than I did," she said. "One where what he thinks matters." "It will," Effie said. "I'll make sure of it." They became, after that, something that was perhaps not quite friendship, but was considerably more than acquaintance. 2 women of different temperaments and different circumstances who had arrived at a shared understanding of what mattered. The years that followed moved in the way that good years move, not slowly, not quickly, but fully, with the sense of time that is actually inhabited rather than endured. Oliver expanded the ranch's eastern pasture as he had planned, acquiring the additional land on terms that were, this time, grounded in careful and realistic assessment rather than the arrogance of a 26-year-old with too much confidence and not enough knowledge. The ranch grew into something that was among the most successful operations in the county, respected not just for its scale, but for the way it was run. The hands were paid fairly and treated as people rather than equipment. The cattle were managed in ways that maintained the land rather than depleting it. And Oliver's reputation in the county had the specific quality of respect that attaches to someone who has been both tested and honest about both the testing and the outcome. Gideon Cross, who was in his mid-60s and had no intention of stopping work until his body required it, was increasingly a presence in James's early life, telling him stories in the evenings while Effie made supper or sat with her books. Stories that contained more history and more truth than children's stories typically did, but that Gideon told with the instinct of someone who understood that children can handle truth if it is given with care. In the spring of 1882, when James was 2 and had recently achieved what could only be described as a position of complete domestic authority, Effie told Oliver that she was expecting again. He took the news with the equanimity of a man who has been through the first time and knows what he's doing, which meant he was warm and glad and immediately practical in the ways he thought might be useful. And Effie accepted the practical things with the grace of someone who has learned, over 3 years of marriage, that accepting care is not the same as needing rescue. Their daughter arrived in December of 1882, dark-haired like her brother, with the kind of alert presence that announces itself immediately to anyone in the room. They named her Eleanor, for no one specific but for the general quality of the name, something strong, something that would hold up. James regarded Eleanor with the solemnity of a child processing a major development. He was polite about it. He was, after several days of adjustment, interested. By the end of the week, he had assigned himself the responsibility of showing her things, holding objects up for her inspection with the patient thoroughness of someone who understands that orientation requires time. Caldwell, by 1883, had changed in the ways that frontier towns were changing all through Kansas, more settled, more established. The cattle drive traffic reduced as the railheads moved south, and the farmers spread across the land that the drovers had moved through. The Grange Hall socials continued, though they were quieter affairs than the ones of the cattle drive years, and the ladies' committee had evolved under the quiet pressure of time and circumstance into something that actually served the community more broadly than it once had. Oliver and Effie went to the socials, now, as a matter of course, not because either of them had ever cared particularly about the social positioning that the events represented, but because they had children and a place in the community, and the events were genuinely pleasant in the way that gatherings are pleasant when you arrive at them without desperation. At the spring social of 1883, Effie stood in the Grange Hall with Oliver's hand at her back and Eleanor on her hip and James circling them at a radius determined by his personal assessment of what interesting things existed in the room's perimeter. And the fiddles played exactly as they had always played, bright and reckless, and the floor was full of spinning skirts and boots striking the boards in rhythm. Martha Greer was there, married now herself to a traveling hardware merchant who seemed pleasant enough in a distracted way, and she drifted past Effie in the crowd, and nodded with the particular nod of a woman who has made her peace with a rearranged social order. Effie nodded back. She found she held no residue of the old injury. It had been real when it happened, and it had shaped her, and she had moved through it and out the other side into a life that had not been promised to her, and that she had had to wait for and stand through the loneliness of waiting for, and it was here now, solid and inhabited and real. Oliver came back from the refreshment table with 2 cups of cider and handed her one, and she shifted Eleanor to her other hip to take it, and he looked at her in the lamplight with that particular look, the one she had first seen across a crowded room when the music stopped, and she thought, as she sometimes did, about the accumulation of ordinary moments that constitute an extraordinary life. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About standing at edges," she said. He understood her without elaboration, because he had come to know her the way you know a person after years of genuine attention, the shorthand of people who have shared enough of themselves that some communication has moved beyond language. "You were never at the edge," he said. "You were waiting at the center of something that hadn't arrived yet." She leaned against him. James appeared at their left side, with the report that there was excellent pie on the refreshment table, and a strongly worded suggestion that everyone should investigate it immediately. Eleanor reached for Oliver's hat with the purposeful determination of a 1-year-old who has identified a target. Oliver let her have it and watched her examine it with the grave interest of a tiny scientist. The fiddles played. The hall was full of light and people, and the specific noise of a community gathered in its own company. And outside the spring evening was warm with the first warmth of the year, and the stars were out over the Great Plains in their unreasonable abundance. Effie Hawthorne, Effie Langston, now, 3 years and counting into the life she had built from $11.40, and a letter from the Methodist Ladies' Society, and a great deal of stubborn dignity, stood in the center of the room with her family around her, and felt the fullness of it. The specific, inhabitable fullness of a life that is exactly what it should be. 2 years later, in the spring of 1885, they welcomed a second son, whom they named after Gideon Cross because Gideon had been right about most things his whole life, and because the quiet debt of honest friendship deserved more than words. Gideon Cross received the honor with the restraint of a man who does not show large emotions in large ways, which meant he was silent for a full minute, and then said that the boy had better have something worth doing before they attached his name to it. He was, of course, the most devoted presence in young Gideon Langston's early life, and the child grew up with both the history of the country he'd been born into and the history that the old man carried, and was the richer for having both. Oliver and Effie built the east wing of the ranch house the summer of 1886, when it became apparent that the original structure, roomy as it was, had not been designed for a family of 5 plus a foreman who was effectively family by every measure that counted. The new rooms included a larger schoolroom, because Effie had, by this point, established what amounted to a small private teaching arrangement from the ranch house for the children of several neighboring ranching families, in the years when getting to Caldwell regularly was impractical, and a study off the parlor that was primarily Effie's, with bookshelves along 3 walls and a desk at the east-facing window where she wrote in the evenings and thought, and sent letters to the school board about the state of rural education in the county, and had begun drafting something that she thought might eventually be a formal proposal for an expanded district school that would serve the farming and ranching families who were too far from Caldwell to benefit from the current system. Oliver read her drafts. He read them carefully, as he read everything she wrote, and he offered the kind of feedback that she had come to depend on, not the reflexive encouragement of a husband who wants his wife to be happy, but the genuine, honest response of someone who respects the work enough to engage with it seriously. "The argument on page 3, he said one evening, turning the pages at the kitchen table, doesn't account for the cost structure from the district's side. If you want the board to take this seriously, you need to address how it gets funded." "I know," she said. "I'm working on that section. The rest of it is very strong," he said. "The case you make for the children specifically, the argument about what they lose by not being in school, that's very clear." "It's what I know," she said. "I've been watching children lose things they could have had for 7 years now." He looked up from the paper. "You've given them back considerably more than they lost," he said. She accepted the observation without deflecting it, which was something that had taken years of practice. "We have," she said. "Together, you funded the evening sessions. You sent your hands to be educated. You built me a schoolroom in the East Wing." "I was working with what I had," he said, with the complete simplicity that she had come to love most in him, not the grandeur of a man performing virtue, but the direct, unpretentious fact of someone who considers the decent thing to be the obvious thing, the logical thing, the only thing. Thomas Whitfield, who was by now 17 and had consumed every book in Effie's library and a fair portion of Oliver's, had been corresponding with a professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, who had read an essay Thomas submitted through a teacher acquaintance, and had expressed strong interest in having him as a student. Clara Whitfield brought this news to Effie with a pride that was completely genuine and a gratitude that was even more so, and Effie felt the particular satisfaction of watching a seed she had planted in the earliest days of her time in Caldwell grow into something that would far exceed anything she had initially imagined. She wrote Thomas a letter of recommendation that she thought was the best piece of writing she had done since the proposal she had sent to the school board, which was saying something. She wrote it with the honesty that she applied to everything, acknowledging not just his gifts but the specific quality of his character, the willingness to be wrong, the capacity to revise his thinking when evidence required it, the rare combination of ambition and genuine humility. He left for Lawrence in the fall of 1887, and the leaving felt like a completion, a thing that had been begun, in a schoolroom on a September morning when a gap-toothed 8-year-old told her the truth about snakes in lunch pails, arriving at its proper destination. That winter, Oliver came home from a business trip to Wichita with a small parcel that he set on the kitchen table, with the contained expression of a man who has done something he is pleased with and is not going to announce it ahead of time. Effie opened the parcel. Inside was a book, the collected essays of a woman who had been writing about rural education in the Western Territories, published by a press in Boston. And on the inside cover was an inscription that read, in the press editor's hand, "With the compliments of the publisher and the sincere admiration of everyone who has read your proposal, which Mr. Langston was kind enough to share with us when he was in our offices." She looked at Oliver. "Your school board proposal," he said, in the tone of a man who is not sure if he has done the right thing and is prepared to be corrected. "I took a copy to Wichita. A man I know there has a contact at the educational press in Boston. He passed it along. They want to discuss publishing it." She held the book in one hand and looked at him for a long moment. "You shared my work without asking me," she said. "I did," he said. "I was wrong to do it without asking. But I also believed in it absolutely, and I thought it deserved to be seen by people with the means to act on it. I'm prepared to be told I overstepped." She looked at the book. She looked at him. She put the book down on the table and crossed the kitchen and kissed him with the emphatic warmth of a woman who is choosing to lead with the generous interpretation of a complicated gesture. "You overstepped," she said, against his mouth. "I know," he said. "Do it again and ask me first," she said. "Yes," he said, "I will." "But thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said, and held her with the ease of years and the warmth of something that had not dimmed but had, if anything, deepened with the specific depth that comes from being known completely and loved in spite of and because of everything. The Boston Press published her proposal in 1888 as part of a volume of writings about educational reform in the American West. It reached people she had never expected: school board members in 3 states, a state legislator in Kansas who wrote her a letter of genuine engagement, and eventually contributed in some small but real way to the expansion of rural school districts across the region that served thousands of children who would otherwise have had the same educational deficits that Willis and Charlie and Rufus had carried through their adult lives before 3 evenings a week in a lamplight schoolroom had changed what was possible for them. The ranch in those years was prosperous and alive, and the family that moved through it had the quality of something built to last. James, who was 8 in 1888 and had inherited both his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, had developed a consuming interest in the mechanics of things: how water moved through pipe and channel, how wheels and gears worked, how a mill operated. Oliver, who recognized the specific quality of a person whose gifts are already pointing somewhere, took him to a mill in Wichita and to an engineer he knew who was surveying an irrigation project. And James asked questions for 3 hours straight and came home with a notebook full of observations and the satisfied expression of someone who has confirmed what they already suspected about themselves. Eleanor, who was 5 in 1887 and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's refusal to yield, had the particular quality of knowing exactly what she thought at all times and communicating it with a directness that Oliver found completely familiar and Effie found simultaneously challenging and deeply satisfying. She was the kind of child who would grow into the kind of woman that Martha Greer's world was not designed for, and that the world was slowly, imperfectly, necessarily becoming. Young Gideon, who was 3, had his namesake's even temperament and was already, at 3, collecting things: stones, feathers, pieces of interesting wood, and arranging them with a focus and precision that suggested a person who would find meaning in careful observation of the physical world. And through all of this, through the years and the seasons and the work and the children and the mornings at the east window and the evenings at the kitchen table, the fundamental thing that had begun on an October evening when the music stopped and a man walked across a crowded room, that thing continued and deepened and proved itself real in the way that only time can prove anything real. Effie had not come to Caldwell expecting what she found there. She had come with $11.40 and a letter from the Methodist Ladies' Society, and a determination to make a life that was worth having, and she had made that life. though not at all in the shape she would have predicted on the afternoon stage from Wichita when the town was just a name, and the future was entirely opaque. The life she had made contained a man who saw her clearly from the beginning, and had the patience to wait until the right moment and the courage to act on it when it came. It contained children who were themselves in the complete way that children are only themselves when they have been seen and taken seriously. It contained a foreman who was one of the wisest people she had ever known. It contained a student who would go to university and write letters back with his observations about Cicero and the plains both. It contained a kitchen garden and 3 shelves of books and an east-facing window with a chair in front of it. It contained what her father had told her education could be, but had not told her love could be, not protection and not reward, but something more precise and more necessary. The thing that makes the best version of yourself possible. The thing that holds the space while you grow into it. On a particular October evening in 1888, 10 years, nearly exactly, from the night the music stopped, Oliver and Effie sat on the porch of the ranch house after supper. The children were in bed. Gideon Cross was somewhere inside. The night was the particular clear October kind, cold at the edges but warm where you were sitting, and the stars were out over the plains in their vast, indifferent abundance. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Oliver said, "if I'd walked in after the music started again?" "I think about it," she said, "less than I used to. What do you think?" She considered this with the care she gave to everything she thought about. "I think that if you'd asked me to dance in the usual way in the middle of the usual music, I might have been glad, but I wouldn't have understood what it meant. The music stopping first, the silence, that was what made it different. That was what told me that you'd been watching, that you'd been paying attention, that you chose the moment rather than the convenient opportunity." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "I wasn't as calculated as that sounds," he said. "I didn't plan to arrive when the music stopped. The wagon had a broken wheel fitting and I was late." She looked at him. "You're telling me that the moment I have spent 10 years believing was a deliberate act of romantic intention was an accident of wagon maintenance?" "The moment I walked across the room to you was intentional," he said. "Every single step. The timing was a broken wheel fitting." She laughed. The laugh went out into the October dark, and the horses in the pasture shifted somewhere below, and the stars continued their unreasonable abundance overhead. "It doesn't matter," she said when she could. "The moment was real whether you planned it or not. What matters is what you did with it." "What did I do with it?" he asked, and he was looking at her with the same directness he had always had, the look that had not changed in 10 years, that had not become habitual or diminished by familiarity, but had, if anything, become more itself over time, more fully what it always was. "You walked across the room," she said, "when it would have been easier not to, when I had spent months invisible and you could have left it that way. You saw me and you said so in front of everyone without hesitation or shame. You were not difficult to see," he said. "The mystery was never why I saw you. The mystery was why no one else did." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I think some people are visible only to the right eyes." He reached over and took her hand, the old familiar warmth of his hand around hers, and they sat together in the October dark on the porch of the life they had built, and the stars were out, and the night was cold and clear, and the sound of the creek came up from the pasture in its continuous, patient conversation with the dark, and everything was exactly, fully, completely as it should be. This was the thing that the woman who had stood at the edges of rooms holding her chin level could not have imagined from that position. Not that the loneliness would end, though it did, but that it would become something instructive rather than merely painful. That the standing and the waiting and the held chin stubbornness of all those dark edges had been building something in her that the easy path would not have built. That the woman who arrived in a new town with $11.40 and a letter from the Methodist Ladies' Society and the Latin she did not need was precisely the woman that a man like Oliver Langston, serious, honest, capable of real seeing, would wait for, would notice in a crowded room above all other options, would cross a silent floor to reach. The stage she had been waiting for had not been coming in the direction Martha Greer assumed. It had been coming from the inside out, from the depth that loneliness will build in you if you let it, from the stubborn refusal to be made smaller by being overlooked, from 11 years of her father's Latin and 3 shelves of books and 30 cents a session, and the circle of a lamp in an empty schoolroom. And on the night of the Harvest Social in 1878, it had arrived. The music had stopped, and Oliver Langston had walked through the door.